The courtroom was supposed to be a place of solemnity, where grief was met with respect and justice was the only language spoken. But when a teenage killer faced Judge Judy and the shattered family of his victim, he did the unthinkable. He laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, not a slip of emotion, but a deliberate, arrogant laugh that echoed through the chamber, slicing through a mother's tears like a blade. To him, their pain was a performance, and he was the star of the show. What no one in that moment realized, however, was that this very arrogance would be the spark that lit the path to his downfall. Because while he thought he had fooled the court, there was someone sitting quietly in the shadows, his own sister, carrying a truth so devastating it would unravel everything he had built and strip away the mask he thought could never be broken. This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of how unchecked arrogance meets its reckoning, and how betrayal from within can expose a monster to the light. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and comment the word justice if you believe no amount of arrogance can silence the truth. The stakes in Judge Judy's courtroom were unlike anything she had faced in her long career. This wasn't a minor civil dispute or even a heated argument between bitter rivals. This was a matter of life and death, of truth versus lies, of whether a grieving family would ever see justice delivered for the daughter they had lost. The air itself felt heavy, as if the entire room understood that the outcome of this trial would ripple far beyond its four walls. The teen killer who sat smirking at the defense table wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting to keep his mask intact, the carefully constructed image of a misunderstood boy rather than the cold predator he truly was. If his deception held, then the world would never know the full horror of his crime, and the family of the victim would be forced to live with the unbearable reality that their daughter's life had been reduced to nothing more than another of his manipulations. For the victim's family, the stakes were painfully clear. They had endured the sleepless nights, the endless news coverage, the cruel whispers in the community about whether their daughter had somehow brought this tragedy upon herself. And now, sitting only feet away from the one who had taken her life, they could feel his contempt radiating toward them. Every arrogant glance, every mocking laugh was a reminder that he believed he was untouchable, that their pain only fueled his ego. If the court allowed him to walk free, it wouldn't just be a failure of justice, it would be the ultimate insult. A declaration that arrogance and deceit could triumph over truth and grief. But the stakes weren't confined to the victim's family alone. They extended to the very credibility of the justice system itself. Judge Judy, a woman known for her sharp wit and her refusal to be deceived, now found herself staring into the hollow eyes of a killer who had already mocked her authority before the trial even truly began. If he managed to manipulate the courtroom and escape the consequences of his actions, it wouldn't just embolden him. It would send a chilling message to every predator watching. That charm, arrogance, and shameless lies could overpower even the most determined pursuit of justice. The courtroom wasn't just on trial. The integrity of justice itself was being tested. And then there were the silent victims who hadn't yet been counted. Because this wasn't just about one life stolen. It was about the lives he might steal if he were allowed to walk away. His arrogance wasn't a mask he wore temporarily. It was the very fuel that drove him. Behind his smirk and his rehearsed innocence was a hunger for power, for control, for proving that he could outsmart everyone in the room. If he succeeded here, who would he target next? Another friend? Another trusting partner? Another family that would be left shattered in his wake? The stakes weren't just about one family's loss. They were about preventing the creation of more families with the same unhealed wound. Even his own sister understood the gravity of what hung in the balance. She sat in silence then, her lips pressed tightly together, carrying a secret that burned in her chest. She knew what he had told her. She knew the words he had spoken in the dark, the twisted pride with which he had described what he had done. If she stayed silent, she would be complicit. If she spoke, she would betray her blood. And so she sat at the edge of her own breaking point. The stakes for her perhaps the highest of all. She was trapped between loyalty to her family and the crushing moral weight of truth. She knew the courtroom would one day turn to her, and she would have to decide whether to remain a silent witness to evil or to become its destroyer. For the jury, The stakes carried a different kind of weight. 12 ordinary people had been called to decide a case that was anything but ordinary. They had to look past the polished facade of a teenage boy and see the monster underneath. They had to hold fast against the manipulations, the lies, and the theatrics that would no doubt come from the defense table. The decision they made would not only determine his fate, but would stand as a reflection of their city's values, whether arrogance and cruelty could ever outweigh compassion and justice. Each juror carried not just the responsibility of law, but the heavy burden of knowing their verdict would echo in history as either justice delivered or justice denied. This was the stage Judge Judy presided over, a battle not just of legal arguments, but of moral reckoning. The teen killer believed he could laugh his way through grief, sneer at the pain of those who mourned, and still walk away, as if nothing had happened. But the stakes made it clear that this wasn't a game. His arrogance wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. If unchecked, it threatened to corrode everything the courtroom stood for. And while he sat basking in his own ego, convinced of his own invincibility, the truth was already gathering like a storm on the horizon. The stakes were not just high, they were absolute, because in the end this case wasn't about whether he would face punishment. It was about whether arrogance could ever truly escape accountability. It was about whether a courtroom full of grief could be mocked into silence, or whether that silence would be broken by the one voice he never expected in his sister's. What seemed hidden at the start was already pressing against the walls, waiting for the right moment to explode. The stakes were written into every heartbeat of that courtroom. The family's need for closure, the jury's search for truth, the judge's fight for justice, and the sister's unbearable secret. All of it converged into a single inescapable question. When arrogance and truth collide, which will survive? Long before the teenager sat smirking in Judge Judy's courtroom, the story began in the shadows of a friendship built on lies. The victim, a bright and trusting young woman, had believed she was standing shoulder to shoulder with someone who shared her dreams. She was ambitious, compassionate, and full of a quiet determination to make her small successes grow into something larger. To her, loyalty was not optional, it was sacred. Yet loyalty was the very thing her so-called partner had learned to weaponize. The killer was only 17, but arrogance had aged him into something darker. He wasn't satisfied with being a student, a friend, or even a partner in their venture. He wanted control, and he wanted it quickly. He dressed better than his peers, spoke with an ease that felt rehearsed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who thought rules were for other people. To those who met him casually, he seemed charming. But to those who watched closely, there was something hollow in his eyes, a sense that every smile was calculated, every word delivered like a sales pitch. The victim's family remembered how she defended him even when neighbors raised questions. She had poured her time, her money, and her trust into building a dream with him. Whenever his expenses looked suspicious, he had a ready excuse. Whenever she asked to review their accounts, he turned evasive, telling her not to worry, telling her he had it under control. And because she loved the idea of building something together, she accepted the lies. What she couldn't see, what no one could see then, was that the lies weren't a side effect. They were the foundation. By the time her family realized something was wrong, it was too late. Days passed without her answering calls. At first, they assumed she was busy preparing for the next big presentation she had mentioned with pride. But when her father finally used the spare key to step into her small row house, the truth revealed itself with a cold finality. She hadn't been busy. She hadn't been distracted. She had been silenced. The scene inside wasn't one of chaos, but of precision. No overturned furniture, no desperate struggle, just the chilling neatness of calculated violence. It was the killer himself who called the police, his voice carrying the perfect tone of a friend in panic. He told them he was worried, that he had been trying to reach her, that he feared something terrible had happened. To the untrained ear, it sounded like concern. To the seasoned detectives who arrived, it sounded rehearsed. There was something too steady in his tone, too measured in his grief, and while cameras outside captured him wiping fake tears from his face, inside, investigators were already whispering doubts. Detective after detective noted the same detail. He seemed too ready with explanations, too quick to redirect suspicion. When asked about her finances, he suggested she had been hiding debts. When asked about their work, he claimed she had been struggling under the pressure. He painted her as unstable, planting seeds of doubt even as her family wept in disbelief. But the family knew her better. They came forward with messages, emails, and journals where she had confided her worries. Not about her own weakness, but about his spending habits, his evasiveness, and his strange new arrogance. She had been preparing to confront him. She had been preparing to expose him. And that confrontation never came because he had silenced her first. In Philadelphia, a city built on grit and blunt honesty, word spread quickly. People knew the girl, kind, thoughtful, a volunteer at the animal shelter, a neighbor who remembered birthdays. They knew the boy too, but in a different way. His car was too expensive for his age. His clothes felt out of place among working-class families. His charm didn't feel earned. It felt forced. Soon whispers turned to suspicion. The smirk he wore in public wasn't the mask of grief. It was the mask of a predator who believed he could outtalk the truth. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the picture became. The company's bank accounts were nearly drained. Withdrawals had been made in small, careful amounts over months, like a parasite feeding unnoticed. Forged signatures appeared on credit applications. Lavish purchases appeared under her name, while he played the role of the broke student. He had siphoned her resources until there was nothing left but the final obstacle, her realization. And when she was ready to confront him, he decided to erase her completely. By the time the arrest came, the arrogance was no longer hidden. Neighbors saw him led from his parents' home, hands cuffed but head held high as if he were a celebrity taking his place on stage. Reporters noted his calmness. Detectives noted his lack of surprise. It wasn't the demeanor of an innocent boy wrongly accused. It was the demeanor of someone who had already rehearsed this moment in his head, who believed he could still spin the story to his advantage. That's why the trial was never just about one life lost. It was about exposing a pattern of deception so cold that it redefined what arrogance could look like in human form. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a tragic mistake. This was calculation, greed, and the complete absence of remorse. Judge Judy knew it. The jurors could feel it. And the family who sat just a few feet away felt it with every arrogant glance he threw in their direction. Yet even as evidence mounted, as financial records piled up, and as witnesses dismantled his polished lies, he never broke. He never confessed. He never even flinched. Instead, he smiled, corrected detectives' grammar during questioning, and rolled his eyes when prosecutors spoke. In his mind, he was still in control, still above everyone else. What he could not see, what remained hidden from him until the very end, was that his greatest weakness sat in silence on the other side of the courtroom. His sister. She carried the truth he thought no one would ever reveal. And when she finally broke her silence, it would not only crush his arrogance but expose him for what he truly was, a hollow predator who mistook cruelty for power. The crime and its cover-up had laid the stage. The lies, the arrogance, and the precision of his deception had shaped the narrative. But the storm had only begun, and when arrogance collides with truth, one always shatters. The courtroom had seen arrogance before, but never like this. From the moment the trial began under Judge Judy's stern gaze, the teenager acted as though the entire proceeding was beneath him. He leaned back in his chair with an ease that was unsettling, flashing smirks not at his defense attorney or the judge, but at the grieving family sitting only feet away. Every time the victim's mother spoke, his eyes rolled dramatically. When her father described the pain of burying his only daughter, the boy stifled a laugh, shaking his head as if their suffering was nothing more than a tedious inconvenience. Judge Judy, known for her sharp tongue and unwavering command of her courtroom, caught every gesture. She warned him once, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, but the smirk never disappeared. His arrogance had gone from quiet confidence to an open performance. He wanted them to see him laugh. He wanted them to feel mocked. And with every mocking grin, he tested the patience of the court and the endurance of the family who had already lost everything. The jury, at first hesitant to show emotion, began to notice too. A man who could sneer at a mother's tears was no misunderstood teenager. He was something colder, something crueler. Each arrogant movement of his hands, each exaggerated sigh when evidence was read aloud, became another piece of proof, not of his innocence, but of his guilt. It was as if he couldn't help himself, as if mocking pain was his only true language. His defense attorney tried to rein him in, whispering urgently at the table, but the teenager brushed him off with the same smug indifference. He corrected the lawyer mid-sentence, chuckled under his breath when prosecutors laid out evidence, and even leaned toward a bailiff once to make a sarcastic remark loud enough for those nearby to hear. He wasn't just defending himself. He was performing for himself. Every action screamed that he believed he was untouchable, but arrogance has a way of turning strength into weakness. What he didn't know, what was waiting in the wings, was that the very performance he enjoyed so much was sealing his fate. Judge Judy, unwavering, kept her composure, but every note she took, every hard glance she gave, made clear that she was documenting his contempt. The jury was no longer just evaluating evidence, they were evaluating character. And his character, laid bare in every cruel laugh, was destroying him more effectively than any witness could. The family sat in silence, clutching tissues, their grief compounded by his mockery. Yet beneath their pain was a quiet endurance. They knew arrogance always collapses. They could feel that his downfall was coming, and when it did, it would come not from the prosecutors or the judge, but from a place he never expected: his own blood. His sister had remained quiet until then, watching, waiting, but soon she would break the silence, and with her voice the mask he had clung to would shatter forever. When the defense called his sister to the stand, the courtroom expected sympathy. Perhaps she would describe a troubled childhood, a misunderstood brother, a boy who deserved compassion. Instead, what followed was the moment that broke everything. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed on the ground, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. At first, her answers were simple: memories of growing up together, a vague description of family life. But Judge Judy's courtroom has a way of cutting through masks, and when the prosecutor began her cross-examination, the silence grew thick with anticipation. The questions were gentle, but relentless. Did she know about his spending? Had she seen his anger? Did she hear him the night Ella was killed? And then it came, the one question that could no longer be dodged. Where was your brother that night? Her lips quivered, tears running down her cheeks as she looked not at her brother but at the victim's family. He came to my room, she whispered, voice breaking. He said it was done, that she wouldn't be a problem anymore. And then he laughed. The words crashed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The teenager shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage, screaming at his sister, calling her a liar, a traitor. Bailiffs rushed to restrain him, but the damage was already done. His own blood had ripped away the mask, revealing him not as misunderstood, but as a predator who celebrated cruelty. If this shocking turn gave you chills, subscribe and comment exposed so I know you felt the weight of this moment. The moment his sister's words pierced the silence, the arrogance that had carried him through every stage of the trial began to rot from the inside out. His smirk was gone, replaced with a mask of unrestrained fury. He thrashed in his seat, shouting denials, his voice breaking with desperation rather than control. The boy who once laughed at a grieving mother was now screaming like a cornered animal, fighting not for freedom, but for the last shreds of his pride. Judge Judy's gavel thundered across the courtroom, her eyes colder than stone. She had warned him. She had watched his arrogance unfold piece by piece, and now she saw the collapse. You're finished, she declared, silencing his rage with the authority of a voice that could not be defied. For the jury, that was all they needed. His own sister had exposed him, and his own actions had confirmed the truth. He wasn't untouchable. He was unraveling. The family, who had endured his smirks and mockery, now sat with tears of relief. They had waited for this moment, for the arrogance to break, for the mask to shatter. And now it had. The predator had become pitiful, a spectacle of rage and fear. What he once thought made him powerful had only exposed how hollow he truly was. The courtroom had witnessed the transformation, from arrogant boy to broken fraud. The verdict was inevitable, but the collapse itself was the real judgment. The jury needed less than an hour. After days of evidence, after weeks of arrogance, the choice before them was no longer complicated. When they returned, the courtroom was silent, every breath held, every eye fixed on the foreperson. And then, in a voice that shook with the weight of justice, the word was spoken: guilty. The verdict rippled through the gallery like a wave of relief. The victim's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, tears streaming freely. Not tears of joy, because joy could never return, but tears of closure, of finality. They had endured the sneers, the cruel laughter, the yawn that mocked their grief. Now at last they saw the mask ripped away. Their daughter's memory had not been buried beneath his arrogance. Truth had prevailed. The killer sat motionless, his jaw clenched, his smirk threatening to return but unable to hold. For the first time, he wasn't directing the story. He wasn't in control. His sister's betrayal had stolen that power from him, and the jury's verdict had nailed shut the coffin of his arrogance. The boy who believed he was untouchable had been reduced to a criminal stripped of dignity, shackled not just by chains, but by the truth. Weeks later, the sentencing hearing brought the final confrontation. Judge Judy entered with her usual commanding presence, but her words that day carried more weight than any verdict. She spoke directly to him, her tone sharp with disdain. You thought cruelty was strength. You thought laughter could hide your guilt. But today, we see you for what you are. Not a misunderstood boy. Not a genius manipulator, but an empty shell filled with arrogance and greed. Her words cut deeper than any gavel. She reviewed the evidence with piercing clarity. The calculated fraud, the cold-blooded murder, the contempt for the family's grief, the sister's devastating testimony. Each fact was another nail sealing his fate. When she finally looked up, her eyes locked on him with unflinching resolve. You mocked a mother's tears, she said, her voice firm. But today, justice mocks you. The sentence was delivered. Life in prison without parole. A life stripped of freedom, stripped of applause, stripped of the audience he had always craved. He would no longer be the center of attention, except as a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance is not invincibility, and cruelty is not power. As bailiffs moved to take him away, he tried one last act of defiance. He stood, chains clinking, and stared at his sister in the gallery. His lips curled into a sneer, his eyes filled with venom. But it no longer mattered. His words had no power, his threats no weight. The courtroom didn't see a predator anymore. They saw a boy broken by his own arrogance, dragged from the room as his final performance collapsed into nothing. Outside, the family stood together in the cold air, not victorious, but steady. Justice had not erased their grief, but it had given their daughter dignity. They had faced down a boy who mocked their pain and left the courtroom knowing his laughter would echo only in the confines of a prison cell. And in the end, the story was no longer his. It belonged to them, the family who endured, the sister who spoke, and the judge who would not be mocked. His arrogance had been exposed for what it was, weakness dressed as strength. The mask had shattered and nothing remained but the truth. If this story struck you, subscribe and comment the word truth so I know its weight reached you. The air in the executive boardroom crackled with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife, as the security guard's hand hovered just inches from Judge Judy's shoulder. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would expose a conspiracy, so shocking that it would send ripples through every corporate law firm in America, leaving millions of viewers questioning everything they thought they knew about justice in our legal system. Judge Judy Sheindlin, the iron-willed television judge who had commanded respect for decades, stood surrounded by a circle of corporate security personnel, her eyes blazing with the quiet fury of someone who had just uncovered a truth so devastating it could topple empires built on legal manipulation. The head of security, his voice trembling with barely concealed urgency, delivered the message that would ignite a firestorm. Judge Sheindlin, Karen Morrison has personally ordered your immediate removal from these premises. But what neither Karen nor her army of lawyers could have anticipated was that Judge Judy had spent the last 3 weeks conducting her own investigation into Morrison Industries, uncovering a web of legal corruption that stretched from small-town courthouses to the highest levels of corporate America. What she discovered wasn't just unethical, it was a systematic pattern of using legal loopholes as weapons to destroy innocent families while generating millions in profit. The security team expected compliance, perhaps a quiet exit to avoid embarrassment, as countless others had done when faced with Morrison Industries' overwhelming legal machine. They were entirely unprepared for what Judge Judy had hidden in her briefcase evidence, so damning it would expose how America's legal system had been weaponized against its own citizens. This wasn't just another corporate dispute or a clash of egos. This was about Martha Rodriguez, a 67-year-old grandmother whose family restaurant was systematically destroyed by Karen's legal team, driving her to bankruptcy and an early grave while Karen celebrated another victory at her country club. Judge Judy met the security chief's nervous gaze with the steely resolve that had made her a household name, her voice cutting through the corporate atmosphere like a blade. Tell Karen Morrison that I have evidence of what she did to Martha Rodriguez and dozens of others, and absolutely nothing is going to stop me from presenting it to that auditorium full of her business partners." The words hung in the air like a death sentence for Morrison Industries' carefully crafted reputation, because what Judge Judy was about to reveal would prove that Karen hadn't just bent the rules, she had shattered them entirely, leaving a trail of destroyed lives in her wake. If you're ready to witness the moment when America's toughest judge took down one of the most corrupt corporate executives in history, hit that like button right now and drop a gavel emoji in the comments below. What you're about to see will shatter everything you believed about how justice really works in corporate America, and reveal the shocking truth about how powerful people use our legal system as their personal weapon. This isn't just entertainment. This is a masterclass in what happens when someone with real authority refuses to be silenced by money and intimidation. It all began 3 weeks earlier, on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of day that starts quietly, but carries within it the seeds of something extraordinary. Judge Judy was reviewing case files in her Manhattan office when her assistant knocked on the door, holding a phone with an expression that suggested this wasn't just another routine call. The voice on the other end belonged to Rebecca Martinez, personal assistant to Karen Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, one of the largest corporate consulting firms on the East Coast. Her tone was honeyed with the kind of practiced charm that expensive PR firms teach their clients, each word carefully selected to convey importance and exclusivity. "Judge Scheindlin," Rebecca began, her voice practically radiating enthusiasm, "Ms. Morrison would be deeply honored if you would consider being our keynote speaker at the annual Corporate Legal Excellence Summit. We're talking about an audience of over 2,000 of the nation's most influential business leaders, executives, and legal professionals." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the magnitude of the opportunity sink in before continuing. "Ms. Morrison specifically requested you because she believes your unique perspective on justice and accountability would provide invaluable insights to help these leaders understand how proper legal procedures can create more ethical and profitable business outcomes." But Judge Judy hadn't survived decades in the legal system by accepting things at face value, especially when they came wrapped in corporate speak and delivered with theatrical enthusiasm. Something about Rebecca's carefully crafted pitch struck a discordant note that resonated deep in her judicial instincts. The phrase "profitable business outcomes" hung in the air like a red flag, because in Judge Judy's experience, when corporations started talking about profit and legal procedures in the same breath, it usually meant someone was about to get screwed, and it wasn't going to be the people with expensive lawyers. Rebecca continued her pitch, seemingly oblivious to the growing skepticism on the other end of the line. "The theme of this year's summit is maximizing legal advantages in modern business, and we believe your expertise could help our attendees understand how to navigate complex legal challenges while maintaining the highest standards of corporate responsibility." The words flowed smoothly, but Judge Judy's finely tuned bullshit detector was already sending up warning signals. In her decades of experience, she had learned that when people talked about maximizing legal advantages and corporate responsibility, in the same sentence they were usually planning to do something that would make her want to bang her gavel until it broke. The compensation package Rebecca outlined was certainly generous, almost suspiciously so. A 5-figure speaking fee, first-class accommodations, and what she described as an opportunity to influence how America's business leaders approach legal decision-making. But Judge Judy had built her reputation on reading between the lines, and what she was reading between these particular lines made her stomach turn. This wasn't an invitation to share wisdom about justice. This felt like a carefully orchestrated attempt to get her endorsement for practices that she suspected would make her want to hold someone in contempt of court. As Rebecca wrapped up her pitch with promises of how much the business community would benefit from Judge Judy's unique perspective on efficient legal resolution, the judge found herself wondering what exactly Morrison Industries thought she would say that would help them maximize their legal advantages. Did they expect her to teach corporate executives how to intimidate plaintiffs into settling? Were they hoping she would provide strategies for overwhelming small-time lawyers with paperwork and procedural delays? The very thought made her blood pressure rise, because if there was one thing Judge Judy couldn't stomach, it was the abuse of legal power to crush people who couldn't fight back. Judge Judy's response was carefully measured, her years of judicial experience having taught her the value of gathering information before making decisions. "Ms. Martinez," she said, her voice carrying just enough interest to keep the conversation going, while revealing nothing of her growing suspicions. "This sounds like quite an impressive event. I'd like some time to review the materials and consider how I might contribute meaningfully to your summit." What she didn't tell Rebecca was that she had already decided to conduct her own investigation into Morrison Industries, because something about this invitation felt like a setup, and Judge Judy had never walked into a courtroom unprepared in her life. After ending the call, Judge Judy sat in her office for several long minutes, staring out at the Manhattan skyline while her mind processed what she had just heard. The pieces of the puzzle were already forming a picture she didn't like, but she needed more information before she could be certain. She had learned long ago that in the legal world, the most dangerous opponents were the ones who hid their true intentions behind flowery language and generous offers. If Morrison Industries was trying to buy her credibility to legitimize questionable practices, they had picked the wrong judge. The invitation packet that arrived by courier the next morning only deepened her suspicions. Glossy brochures showcased previous summit speakers, all of whom seemed to specialize in helping corporations optimize legal strategies and minimize litigation exposure. The agenda was filled with sessions on topics like advanced settlement, negotiation techniques, leveraging procedural advantages, and managing class action vulnerabilities. These weren't workshops on justice and fairness. They were masterclasses in legal warfare designed to help big corporations crush anyone who dared to challenge them. But it was the brief biography of Karen Morrison herself that really caught Judge Judy's attention. The official version painted her as a visionary leader who had revolutionized corporate legal consulting by helping businesses navigate complex regulatory environments. What it didn't mention was the growing whisper network of lawyers who had faced Morrison's tactics in court, stories of legal intimidation, procedural manipulation, and the systematic exploitation of power imbalances that left smaller opponents financially and emotionally devastated. Judge Judy closed the invitation packet and reached for her phone, dialing the number of her longtime friend and investigator Tony Chen, a former NYPD detective who now specialized in corporate research. "Tony," she said when he answered, "I need you to dig into a company called Morrison Industries and its CEO Karen Morrison. I want to know everything: financial records, legal cases, employee complaints, and especially any patterns of litigation they've been involved in." She paused, her judicial instincts already telling her what he was likely to find. "And Tony, I have a feeling this one's going to get ugly." As she hung up the phone, Judge Judy felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through countless difficult cases. If Karen Morrison thought she could use Judge Judy's reputation to legitimize predatory legal practices, she was about to learn that some judges couldn't be bought, intimidated, or fooled. The summit was still 2 weeks away, but Judge Judy's real investigation was just beginning, and what she was about to uncover would make this corporate legal conference into something Karen Morrison would never forget. Tony Chen's initial research findings landed on Judge Judy's desk 72 hours later, in a manila folder that felt heavier than its actual weight suggested. What she discovered inside made her hands tremble with barely contained rage, because the pattern of systematic legal abuse was even worse than her darkest suspicions had imagined. Morrison Industries hadn't just bent the rules, they had weaponized America's legal system into a precision instrument of financial destruction, targeting small businesses, elderly plaintiffs, and working-class families who couldn't afford to fight back against an army of corporate attorneys. The case files Tony had assembled painted a horrifying picture of legal predation that stretched across multiple states and countless shattered lives. There was Robert Chen, a 54-year-old contractor whose small construction company was buried under an avalanche of frivolous lawsuits after he tried to collect payment for completed work. Morrison's legal team had filed 17 separate motions, demanded countless depositions, and stretched the case across 3 years until Chen's business collapsed under the weight of legal fees, forcing him to declare bankruptcy, while Morrison Industries celebrated another successful risk mitigation strategy. Then came the case of elderly couple Harold and Marge Peterson, both in their 70s, who had dared to file a product liability claim after Harold was injured by a defective ladder manufactured by one of Morrison's clients. Karen's legal machine had subjected them to invasive discovery demands, scheduling depositions during Harold's cancer treatments, and filing motion after motion designed to exhaust their limited resources. The Petersons eventually dropped their case not because they were wrong, but because they couldn't afford to be right against Morrison's unlimited legal budget. But it was the file marked Martha Rodriguez that stopped Judge Judy cold, her heart sinking as she read the details of what would become her personal call to arms. Martha had owned Rodriguez Family Restaurant, a small Mexican eatery in Queens that had been serving the community for over 20 years, employing local families and providing authentic food with the kind of love that only comes from genuine family recipes. When a Morrison Industries client wanted to acquire her building for development, Martha had respectfully declined their initial offers, hoping to pass the restaurant down to her children as she had always dreamed. Karen Morrison's response had been swift and merciless. Within weeks, Rodriguez family restaurant found itself drowning in a tsunami of legal challenges, health department complaints that materialized out of nowhere, zoning violations that had never existed before, and a barrage of nuisance lawsuits that consumed every penny Martha had saved over 2 decades of hard work. Morrison's attorneys had turned Martha's American dream into a legal nightmare, systematically dismantling her business through procedural warfare that left her defenseless against their unlimited resources. The final entry in Martha's file was a handwritten letter from her daughter, Elena, describing how her mother had died 6 months after losing the restaurant, her spirit broken by a legal system she had believed would protect honest, hardworking people like herself. She kept saying she didn't understand how being right could be so wrong, Elena had written. She died believing the law had abandoned her. The night before the summit, Judge Judy sat alone in her hotel room overlooking the glittering Houston skyline. Martha Rodriguez's handwritten letter spread out on the desk before her like evidence in the most important case of her career. She wasn't rehearsing talking points or polishing a keynote speech because what she was preparing for had nothing to do with corporate presentations and everything to do with confronting a system that had perverted justice into a weapon against the innocent. The weight of Elena Rodriguez's words pressed against her chest like a physical force. She died believing the law had abandoned her. This wasn't about Judge Judy's reputation or her television career, or even her legendary courtroom persona. This was about Martha Rodriguez, who had believed in the fundamental promise of American justice that hard work and honesty would be rewarded, that the legal system existed to protect people like her from those who would exploit their power. Instead, Martha had discovered that in Karen Morrison's world, the law wasn't about right and wrong, it was about who could afford the biggest legal army and who was willing to use procedural warfare to crush anyone who stood in their way. Judge Judy thought about the oath she had taken decades ago, the solemn promise to uphold justice and defend those who couldn't defend themselves. She reflected on the countless cases she had presided over, the moments when she had been the last line of defense between powerful interests and vulnerable people who needed someone to speak truth to power. Tomorrow wouldn't be another television appearance or a speaking engagement for a generous fee. Tomorrow would be her chance to honor Martha Rodriguez's memory by exposing the truth that Karen Morrison had spent millions trying to bury. As she folded Elena's letter and placed it carefully in her briefcase, Judge Judy felt the familiar surge of righteous determination that had defined her entire career. She had faced down lying litigants, corrupt attorneys, and manipulative corporations before, but never with stakes this personal or this clear. Martha Rodriguez had trusted the system and died broken-hearted when it failed her. Judge Judy wouldn't let that trust be betrayed without consequences. The judge who would walk into that conference center tomorrow morning wouldn't be there to play nice with corporate executives or deliver feel-good platitudes about legal ethics. She would be there as Martha Rodriguez's advocate, armed with evidence of systematic abuse and the unshakable conviction that some truths are too important to keep buried, regardless of who gets uncomfortable when they're exposed. Judge Judy arrived at the Houston Convention Center with Martha Rodriguez's letter, tucked securely in her briefcase, and a determination that radiated from her like heat from a furnace. The backstage area buzzed with corporate energy, but that atmosphere shifted the moment 3 security guards approached her with the kind of purposeful stride that meant trouble was about to unfold. Judge Scheindlin, the lead guard said, his voice carrying the uncomfortable tension of someone delivering bad news. There's been a change of plans. Ms. Morrison has requested that we escort you from the premises immediately. His hand hovered near her arm, clearly expecting compliance from someone who had probably never been escorted anywhere against her will in her entire life. Judge Judy's response was swift and devastating. She opened her briefcase and withdrew Elena Rodriguez's handwritten letter, holding it up like a piece of evidence that could convict the guilty. "Before you lay a hand on me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in courtrooms, "I want you to hear something from Elena Rodriguez, whose mother died because your boss turned the legal system into a weapon." She began reading, aloud, her voice steady but filled with controlled fury. "My mother worked 16-hour days for 20 years building her restaurant. Karen Morrison's lawyers destroyed it in 6 months with lawsuits that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with forcing her to sell. She died believing she had failed, when the real failure was a system that lets people like Karen Morrison buy victories." The guard stood frozen, unprepared for this moment of moral confrontation. The massive auditorium doors burst open with a thunderous crash as Judge Judy strode down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing through the stunned Silence of 2,000 corporate executives who had expected a polite keynote about legal efficiency. Karen Morrison's voice faltered mid-sentence as she spotted the approaching figure. Her carefully rehearsed presentation about maximizing litigation outcomes dying in her throat as Judge Judy's presence filled the cavernous space with an undeniable force that no amount of corporate security could contain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Judy announced, her voice cutting through the shocked murmurs as she commandeered the microphone from a bewildered moderator. "My name is Judge Judy Shaindlin, and I'm here to tell you about Martha Rodriguez, a woman who can no longer speak because the practices being celebrated at this summit killed her." The auditorium erupted in confused whispers as Judge Judy pulled Elena's letter from her briefcase, holding it aloft like damning evidence in a murder trial. Karen Morrison's face had gone ashen, her polished corporate composure cracking like ice under pressure as Judge Judy continued her devastating testimony. Martha Rodriguez owned a small restaurant in Queens that served her community for 20 years. When she refused to sell to one of Ms. Morrison's clients, they unleashed a legal assault that would make a medieval siege look merciful. The audience, accustomed to sanitized discussions of legal strategy, found themselves confronting the human cost of the tactics they had come to learn. Judge Judy's voice rose with righteous fury as she read directly from Elena's letter. "They filed 67 separate legal actions against my mother's restaurant health violations that materialized overnight. Zoning complaints for a building that had passed inspection for decades. Nuisance lawsuits designed to bleed her dry. She spent her life savings fighting cases that had no merit but unlimited funding." Several executives in the front row shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own company's tactics in the devastating account. "Karen Morrison," Judge Judy said, turning to face the CEO directly, her gaze boring into Morrison's soul with the intensity of a laser. "Martha Rodriguez worked 16-hour days to build something beautiful for her community. Your legal team destroyed it in 6 months using procedural warfare that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with crushing someone who couldn't fight back. How many more Martha Rodriguez stories are buried in your company's files?" Morrison attempted to regain control, her voice shaking as she stammered, "Judge Shaindlin, this isn't the appropriate forum for—" But Judge Judy cut her off with the commanding presence that had made her a household name. "This is exactly the appropriate forum. You invited me here to legitimize legal tactics that destroy innocent people's lives. Martha Rodriguez died believing she had failed when the real failure was a system that allowed you to weaponize justice itself." The auditorium had become a powder keg of emotion. Corporate attorneys were frantically checking their phones, several summit sponsors were heading for the exits, and a group of younger lawyers near the back stood up and began a slow clap that spread through sections of the crowd like wildfire. The convention center's head of security appeared at the side of the stage, but when he saw Judge Judy's unwavering stance and heard the growing applause, he simply removed his radio and walked away, refusing to be part of silencing the truth. Judge Judy's final words rang through the stunned auditorium like a battle cry. "Martha Rodriguez's daughter asked me to tell people the truth about how corporate America uses our legal system as a weapon. That truth is this: when lawyers become hired guns instead of officers of the court, justice dies, and people like Martha Rodriguez pay the ultimate price." If watching Judge Judy expose corporate legal corruption live on stage just blew your mind, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell right now, because this story is about to get even more explosive, and you don't want to miss what happens when the most powerful judge in America declares war on a system designed to crush the innocent. The auditorium erupted in chaos as Judge Judy's words reverberated through the corporate elite, with dozens of executives canceling contracts with Morrison Industries on the spot. Karen Morrison fled the stage in humiliation, her legal empire crumbling as whistleblowers emerged from her own company. Within hours, Martha Rodriguez's story had gone viral, sparking federal investigations into corporate legal abuse and inspiring new legislation protecting small businesses from frivolous litigation warfare. Judge Judy had done more than expose one corrupt executive. She had ignited a movement that would reshape how America's legal system serves justice instead of profit. Martha Rodriguez finally had her voice, and it was roaring. If you want to see more truth-tellers take on corrupt power structures, subscribe now and join the fight for real justice. Because when good people stay silent, the system wins, but when they speak up, everything changes. Karen Martinez clutched her $3,000 Hermes bag like a lifeline as she sat in Judge Judy's plaintiff chair, her perfectly manicured fingers already reaching for tissues that weren't there. The 34-year-old had spent 3 hours that morning perfecting her struggling single mother look, complete with a $400 blouse she'd bought specifically for this performance. Her mascara was strategically applied to run at just the right moment, and her voice was already taking on that practiced trembling quality that had gotten her out of traffic tickets, retail disputes, and countless other consequences throughout her entitled life. Judge Judy Sheindlin sat behind her bench, reading glasses perched on her nose, completely unaware that she was about to witness the most spectacular courtroom meltdown in television history. Karen had researched every angle, watched dozens of episodes, and convinced herself that America's toughest judge would fall for the same manipulation tactics that had worked on every authority figure she'd ever encountered. She had no idea that hidden in Judge Judy's case file was a social media screenshot that would destroy her entire carefully constructed narrative in a single devastating moment. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. What Karen didn't know was that Judge Judy had already spotted every designer detail that contradicted her sob story, from the fresh $200 manicure to the $800 shoes that would later become evidence of her deception. As Karen prepared to deploy her trademark tears and victim-playing performance, she was walking directly into a trap that would expose not just her lies about being broke, but her private messages bragging about manipulating the legal system itself. The woman who had spent years weaponizing fake tears and false victimization was about to discover that Judge Judy's courtroom was unlike any place she'd ever tried to manipulate her way through. This wasn't just another small claims case about a $2,500 security deposit. This was the moment when manufactured victimhood would collide head-on with authentic authority, when crocodile tears would meet documented evidence, and when Karen's entire world of consequence-free manipulation would crumble in exactly 47 seconds of devastating cross-examination. When the bailiff announced, case number 1247, Martinez versus Peterson, Karen took what she thought would be her final deep breath as a victim of circumstance, completely unaware that she was about to become the poster child for why lies always catch up to liars. Judge Judy looked up from her file with that unmistakable expression of someone who had seen every con, every sob story, and every attempt to game the system, and Karen Martinez was about to learn the hardest lesson of her manipulative life. Before we dive into this absolutely incredible courtroom destruction, smash that like button if you're ready to see Karen get completely demolished by the Queen of Justice herself. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss these jaw-dropping moments when entitled, People Meet Their Match. Comment below if you think you know what Judge Judy found in those social media messages, because trust me, you have no idea how devastating this gets. The tension in that Manhattan courtroom was electric, because everyone sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary, but nobody could have predicted the nuclear-level destruction that was coming. This wasn't just another dispute over a security deposit between a tenant and landlord. This was a collision between two completely different worlds, two opposing philosophies about how life should work, and the outcome would determine whether manipulation or truth would triumph on national television. For Karen Martinez, everything was on the line. Her entire adult life had been built on a foundation of weaponized tears, strategic victimization, and the belief that the right performance could get her out of any consequence. She had perfected this system through years of practice, from crying her way out of speeding tickets to sobbing her way into manager discounts at high-end stores. Her ex-husband's generous alimony payments funded her luxury lifestyle, but she had become addicted to the power that came from making people feel sorry for her. Walking into Judge Judy's courtroom represented the ultimate test of her manipulation skills, the chance to prove that even America's toughest judge could be fooled by the right combination of tears and victim-playing. For Judge Judy Sheindlin, this case represented everything she had spent decades fighting against in the American legal system. After 25 years on television and decades before that in family court, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect deception, manipulation, and entitlement from the first sentence out of someone's mouth. Her reputation was built on one unshakable principle: that facts matter more than feelings, that evidence trumps emotion, and that the truth always surfaces no matter how skilled the performance. She had seen every sob story, every crocodile tear, and every attempt to manipulate the system. But something about Karen's case had caught her attention in a way that made her do extra research, dig deeper into the evidence, and prepare for what she suspected would be a masterclass in exposing deception. Judge Judy's integrity and the credibility of her entire courtroom philosophy hung in the balance, because if Karen could successfully manipulate America's most no-nonsense judge, it would send a message that consequences were optional for anyone willing to put on a good enough show. The audience could sense the electricity in the air as these two forces prepared to collide. Karen sat there radiating false vulnerability, her designer accessories carefully chosen to look expensive enough to maintain her self-image, but not so obvious that they would immediately expose her lies about being financially desperate. She had rehearsed her story dozens of times, perfected every pause, every voice crack, and every strategic tear that had gotten her out of consequences her entire adult life. Her confidence was bulletproof because this system had never failed her before, and she genuinely believed that Judge Judy would be just another authority figure who would fall for her practiced performance of victimhood. But Judge Judy sat behind her bench like a predator who had already spotted her prey, armed with evidence that Karen didn't even know existed, prepared to dismantle not just her case but her entire worldview about how consequences work in the real world. The stage was set for the most devastating courtroom takedown in television history, and Karen Martinez had absolutely no idea that she was about to become a cautionary tale about what happens when manufactured. Tears meet authentic authority, Judge. Judy removed her reading glasses with deliberate precision and fixed Karen with the kind of stare that had made seasoned attorneys sweat in family court for decades. Ms. Martinez, you're suing your former landlord, Mr. Peterson, for the return of your $2,500 security deposit. Tell me exactly what happened. Her voice carried that unmistakable tone of someone who had already read between the lines, but was giving the plaintiff just enough rope to hang herself with. Karen's transformation was immediate and theatrical. Her voice took on that practiced, trembling quality she had perfected through years of manipulation, complete with the slight catch that suggested barely contained emotion. Your Honor, I was the perfect tenant for 8 months, she began, her eyes already starting to glisten with what appeared to be genuine tears. I never caused any problems. I always paid my rent early, and I kept that apartment absolutely spotless because I wanted to set a good example for my children. The first strategic pause came right on cue as Karen dabbed at the corner of her eye with her sleeve, a move calculated to appear more authentic than reaching for tissues. But when I had to move out because of my desperate financial situation, Mr. Peterson just refused to give me back my deposit, Karen continued, her voice breaking in exactly the right places. That $2,500 represents everything to me, Your Honor. It represents groceries for my kids, it represents keeping the electricity on, it represents the difference between having a roof over our heads and living in my car. The performance was flawless, hitting every emotional button that had worked on countless managers, officials, and authority figures throughout her life. Several audience members visibly shifted in their seats, clearly affected by the raw emotion in Karen's voice, and even the usually stoic bailiff glanced sympathetically in her direction. This was exactly the reaction Karen had expected and planned for. The same combination of vulnerability and desperation that had gotten her out of consequences for years. Mr. Peterson, the defendant, looked genuinely uncomfortable as he watched Karen's emotional display, his expression showing the kind of doubt that suggested he was beginning to question his own position in the case. The 58-year-old landlord shifted nervously in his chair, clearly unprepared for this level of theatrical emotion, and Karen could sense his discomfort, like a predator detecting weakness in prey. I tried everything to reason with Mr. Peterson, she continued, her voice rising with manufactured indignation. I begged him to understand my situation. I explained that I'm a single mother doing my best in an impossible situation, but he just wouldn't listen to me. He claimed there was damage to the apartment, but I swear on my children's lives that I left that place in better condition than when I moved in. The religious reference was another calculated move, designed to appeal to traditional values and make any skepticism seem heartless and cruel. Judge Judy's expression remained completely neutral throughout Karen's performance, but her pen tapped once against the bench in a rhythm that seasoned court watchers would have recognized as a warning sign. The slight narrowing of her eyes suggested she was processing not just Karen's words but every micro-expression, every calculated pause, and every perfectly timed emotional beat that felt just a little too rehearsed for genuine desperation. Ms. Martinez, Judge Judy interrupted with surgical precision, you mentioned your desperate financial situation. When exactly did this financial crisis begin? The question seemed innocent enough, but there was something in the judge's tone that suggested she already knew the answer and was simply giving Karen the opportunity to dig herself deeper into a hole of her own making. Karen's tears flowed more freely as she sensed what felt like genuine sympathy from the room. About 4 months ago, Your Honor, when my ex-husband suddenly stopped paying child support, she sobbed, her voice taking on that quality of someone barely holding themselves together. I went from being able to provide for my children to not knowing how I was going to put food on the table. I had to swallow my pride and move back in with my elderly mother because I couldn't afford rent anymore. The story was perfectly crafted to maximize sympathy while explaining away any inconsistencies in her financial situation, and Karen could feel the energy in the room shifting in her favor, just like it always did when she deployed her full arsenal of victimization tactics. But Judge Judy had stopped taking notes entirely, and there was something in her stillness that should have terrified anyone who understood how predators behave when they're about to strike. The judge's next question would begin the systematic dismantling of everything Karen believed about how the world worked. But for now, Karen basked in the sympathy of an audience that had no idea they were watching a master manipulator at work. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair with the kind of calculated stillness that experienced lawyers would have recognized as the calm before a devastating storm. Ms. Martinez, you mentioned that your ex-husband stopped paying child support 4 months ago, which forced you into this terrible financial situation. Her voice carried that deceptively gentle tone that had lured countless liars into false security over the years. That must have been incredibly difficult for a mother trying to provide for her children. Karen nodded vigorously, sensing what felt like genuine empathy from America's toughest judge. It was devastating, Your Honor. One day I thought we were secure, and the next day I realized I couldn't even afford groceries. That's why losing this security deposit is so catastrophic for my family. The tears continued flowing as Karen doubled down on her victim narrative, completely unaware that she was walking directly into a trap that had been carefully constructed from her own lies. I can only imagine how challenging that must be. Judge Judy continued with that same deceptively sympathetic tone. And you mentioned having to move back in with your elderly mother because you couldn't afford rent anymore. That must have been humiliating for someone who had been independent. Karen's performance reached new heights of manufactured vulnerability as she described the supposed shame of losing her financial independence and having to burden her mother with unexpected house guests. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, Your Honor. Having to tell my children that we couldn't live in our home anymore, having to explain why Mommy couldn't buy them the things they needed. The audience was completely captivated by Karen's emotional journey, several people dabbing at their own eyes as they witnessed what appeared to be genuine maternal anguish. But Judge Judy's next move shattered the spell with the precision of a surgical strike. Ms. Martinez, if your financial situation became so desperate 4 months ago, I'm curious about something. She picked up a document from her desk with deliberate slowness, and Karen's stomach should have dropped at the sight of official paperwork. I have here your bank statements for the past 6 months, which you submitted as evidence of your financial hardship. The judge's tone had shifted almost imperceptibly, but anyone who understood courtroom dynamics would have heard the change from sympathy to surgical precision. These statements show regular deposits from your ex-husband's account, including one that was processed just last week. The amounts are consistent with the child support agreement. From your divorce decree, the color drained from Karen's face as she realized her first major lie had been exposed with documented evidence she had provided herself. Those deposits they're not what you think they are, she stammered, her practiced tears suddenly stopping as panic took over. Those are reimbursements for medical expenses that I had to cover myself. But Judge Judy was already reaching for another document, and the predatory stillness in her posture suggested that Karen's financial lies were just the appetizer before the main course of her complete destruction. Judge Judy's expression transformed, from measured skepticism to the kind of cold fury that had made grown attorneys flee courtrooms in terror. Ms. Martinez, medical reimbursements? Her voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that veterans of her courtroom knew meant someone was about to be obliterated. That's interesting, because I also have something else here that paints a very different picture of your so-called financial desperation. She held up a stack of printed pages that made Karen's face go completely white with terror. These are screenshots from your Instagram and Facebook accounts over the past 3 months. Would you like to explain this photo from last Tuesday? The courtroom screen blazed to life with an image of Karen at Nobu, champagne flute raised in celebration, her $3,000 Hermes bag prominently displayed. On the table next to a receipt that clearly showed a $400 dinner bill, the audience gasped audibly as Karen's carefully constructed world of lies began crumbling in real time. My mother treated me for my birthday, she stammered. But her voice had lost all trace of the practiced vulnerability that had fooled so many people before. Your birthday was 6 months ago, according to your case filing, Judge Judy replied with devastating precision. And this dinner was charged to a credit card registered in your name. The next image appeared on screen showing Karen at an exclusive spa, tagged with her own caption reading, "Treating myself because I deserve it," from just 4 days earlier. Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she watched her own social media posts destroy every lie she had told in the past 20 minutes. But wait, there's more. Judge Judy continued with the kind of prosecutorial momentum that had terrified defendants for decades. This credit card statement shows $6,200 in luxury purchases over the past month alone. Spa treatments, designer clothes, expensive restaurants, and luxury shopping sprees. Would you like to explain how someone who can't afford groceries for her children manages this level of spending? Karen's hands trembled as she gripped the chair arms, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather. I was buying things for other people, gifts for my family. But Judge Judy held up her hand with absolute authority, silencing Karen's desperate attempts at explanation. The judge's next revelation sent shockwaves through the entire courtroom. Ms. Martinez, I have something here that I think will interest everyone. She pulled out another document with the kind of theatrical timing that only comes from decades of courtroom experience. These are private messages from your Facebook account, obtained through a legal subpoena after Mr. Peterson's attorney suspected fraud. Karen's face went from white to green as she realized the scope of her exposure. The screen filled with screenshots of Karen's private messages to her friends, and Judge Judy began reading them aloud with devastating clarity. Message from 3 weeks ago. About to take this landlord for everything he's worth. Watch me cry my way out of paying for the damage I caused. These judges always fall for the single mom act. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs of disgust as Karen's true character was exposed in her own words. But Judge Judy wasn't finished destroying her. Here's another one from last week. Going on Judge Judy tomorrow. Practiced my crying in the mirror for hours. By the time I'm done, she'll be writing me a check and probably adopting my kids. The audience's shock turned to outright hostility, as they realized they had been witnessing a calculated performance designed to manipulate their emotions and steal money from an innocent landlord. Karen's carefully constructed mask had been completely ripped away, revealing the entitled, manipulative sociopath underneath. And my personal favorite, Judge Judy continued with cold satisfaction, from 2 days ago. If this old judge thinks she's tougher than me, she's about to learn that nobody out-victims Karen Martinez. I've been perfecting this game since high school. Karen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. This is harassment, she screamed, her composure completely shattered. You can't use my private messages against me? But Judge Judy's response would deliver the final, devastating blow that would turn Karen's attempted manipulation into the most spectacular courtroom meltdown in television history. Judge Judy rose to her full height behind the bench, her presence radiating the kind of absolute authority that comes from decades of dismantling liars and fraudsters. Ms. Martinez, sit down and listen to my judgment, or I will have you removed from this courtroom in handcuffs. The threat of real consequences finally penetrated Karen's hysteria, and she collapsed back into her chair like a deflated balloon. In 25 years on this bench, I have witnessed every form of deception, manipulation, and fraud imaginable, Judge Judy began, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom and righteous fury. But rarely have I seen such a calculated, premeditated attempt to defraud both this court and an innocent defendant. Karen's hands shook uncontrollably as Judge Judy delivered her devastating verdict. Not only do I fine for the defendant and deny your fraudulent claim for the $2,500 security deposit, but I am imposing additional penalties for your contempt of this court. The judge's gavel appeared in her hand like an instrument of divine justice. You are hereby fined $5,000 for perjury and filing false documents. Karen's mouth fell open in shock as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Furthermore, I am adding an additional $5,000 fine for attempting to defraud this court through deliberate deception and manufactured evidence. The total stood at $10,000 in fines, plus legal fees, plus the complete destruction of Karen's reputation on national television. Your Honor, I can't afford... Karen began desperately, but Judge Judy cut her off with surgical precision. You can afford $400 dinners and spa treatments. Ms. Martinez, you can certainly afford to pay the consequences of your criminal behavior. With one final, thunderous slam of her gavel, Judge Judy declared, Case dismissed, and Ms. Martinez, I hope you've learned that lies have consequences in the real world. As Karen stumbled out of the courtroom in complete disgrace, her $800 designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to her social media infamy, the audience remained in stunned silence, processing the nuclear-level destruction they had just witnessed. What had started as Karen's confident attempt to manipulate America's toughest judge had transformed into the most spectacular courtroom meltdown in television history, and the ripple effects were about to change her life forever. Within 30 minutes of the show airing, clips of Karen's complete destruction were trending across every social media platform with hashtags like Karen meets karma and Judge Judy justice spreading faster than wildfire. The moment when Judge Judy read Karen's private messages aloud became the most shared courtroom clip ever recorded, generating over 50 million views in the first 24 hours alone. Late-night comedy shows scrambled to incorporate Karen's meltdown into their monologues, with one host delivering the now-famous line, Karen Martinez learned the hard way that you can't cry your way out of consequences when Judge Judy has the receipts. Her private messages became instant memes, appearing on everything from motivational posters to coffee mugs. With nobody out, victims Karen Martinez becoming the universal punchline for entitled behavior meeting reality. Legal experts praise Judge Judy's systematic dismantling of Karen's lies, noting how the case would be studied in law schools as a masterclass in exposing perjury through social media evidence. For everyday Americans who had encountered their own versions of Karen throughout their lives, watching her complete destruction provided a cathartic release that resonated far beyond entertainment. 3 months later, Karen faced actual criminal charges for perjury and fraud, where her televised meltdown was entered as evidence against her. Her attempt to manipulate the legal system had backfired so spectacularly that she became a cautionary tale about the dangers of weaponizing false victimization in an age where everything is documented and discoverable. The case established new precedents for how private social media communications could expose fraudulent claims in court proceedings. Most importantly, Karen's destruction served as a powerful reminder that in Judge Judy's courtroom, and increasingly in the real world, authentic authority will always triumph over manufactured victimhood, and the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how skilled the performance. What did you think of the most epic courtroom takedown in TV history? Was Karen's complete destruction the most satisfying thing you've ever seen? Smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell, because we've got more incredible moments where entitled people meet their match. Drop a comment with your favorite part of Karen's meltdown. We read every single one and love hearing from you. Don't miss our next video where another Karen learns that consequences are real.